Hello, everyone, and welcome to our third Spring 2021 Core Conversation. I'm Charlie Thomas, Executive Director of ACTC, and I am very happy to have with me today Rick Kamber. Rick is a professor of philosophy at the College of New Jersey and the former president of ACTC. He's going to talk today about Hume's essay on the standard of taste, and then we're going to reconvene on March 5th for a live Zoom Q&A at 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. So please join us on March 5th and ask Rick lots of questions and contribute to this core conversation series. But for now, I'm going to hand it over to Rick and he'll talk to us about Hume. Thanks for doing this, Rick.
Thank you, Charlie. It's a pleasure, honor, really. I want to talk about Hume's relatively short essay of the standard of taste, 1757. I think it's a really nice candidate for a text to be read in a core text course. It's short, as I said, which is always a virtue for students these days. It's quite thought-provoking, and it's also a good introduction to Hume's philosophy in general. The essay addresses several questions, but maybe the central question is what makes a work of art enduring and influential? And by art, Hume has in mind what we would probably call the literary arts mostly, which in his day included eloquence, it included oratory. Now this question, interestingly enough, is pretty much the same question as what makes a core text. Right? What makes the text of enduring interest and influence? Hume writes at one point in the essay, he says, the same Homer who pleased at Athens and Rome 2,000 years ago is still admired at Paris and at London. All the changes of climate, government, religion, and language have not been able to obscure his glory. So that's a very succinct and beautiful conceptualization of what makes a classic, what makes a core text, and for Hume, what makes a work of literary art exceptionally good. Notice that this is the test of time, endurance, appreciation over time. And one could say, I think that Hume's own essay has passed the test of time. Not quite as long as Homer, but we're still reading his essay and finding it to be instructive. So I want to talk really about how to teach this essay. And I guess the first challenge is explaining some of the key terms that Hume uses. He's not very technical, happily. He writes in a fairly straightforward fashion, but he does use some terms that bear a little bit of commentary. One is taste. Another is the word sentiment. So sometimes these words refer to how a thing makes us feel about an object, and sometimes it refers to our judgments about the beauty or the artistic merit of that object. The other two words that we should take note of are standard and rule. Hume defines a standard of taste as a rule by which the various sentiments may be reconciled, at least a decision afforded, confirming one sentiment and condemning another. I would put this a little more succinctly, and I would say what he's talking about here is a principled way of resolving disputes about contrary judgments. Now, another challenge in teaching this essay is Hume's choice of examples. He picks examples which certainly would have been familiar to his own readers, but likely to give 21st century students a little bit of a problem. Here, for example, is another very important passage. And he says, whoever would assert an equality of genius and elegance between Ogilvy and Milton, or Bunyan and Addison, would be thought to defend no less in extravagance than if he had maintained a molehill to be as high as Tenerife, or a pond as extensive as the ocean. Now, again, a memorable passage here, but I would wager that your students don't know who Ogilvy was. Probably not Bunyan, probably not Addison, maybe Milton. So what this requires is a strategy for, I don't think it's probably worth one's time to go into a long explanation of who these people were, but the point is, the point he's trying to make is that even though there are lots of disagreement about taste, over time, people tend to converge on the conviction that one author is really very good and another author not very good. Now, one way to help students appreciate this is to ask them to come up with their own examples. So this will change, you know, from over the years. I mean, if I had asked my students this 10 years ago, I would have gotten a different answer than I'll get today. But ask them, you know, to talk amongst themselves a little bit about, say, what bands they like. And you'll probably find that there are some bands they think are first rate and some that they think are third rate. And that makes the point. Another way of approaching this, and I've done this, is by giving them examples that I think they can observe quickly and relate to without, you know, in the space of 20 minutes or something like that. So here are some of the examples I've used. Comparing paintings by Thomas Kincaid, who was, I think, for a time, America's most financially successful artist. He painted these paintings of little houses out in the woods and so forth, very sort of sweet and charming, Disney-like, and commanded enormous sums of money for them. But if you put up a Kincaid on the one side and a Van Gogh on the other side, most of the students, I found that there are a few exceptions, but 80%, 90% will say, well, the Kincaid is, you know, pretty sad. It looks like something you'd find in a motel, and the Van Gogh is wonderful. Or more appropriate for Hume here would be works of literature. And here, for a quick comparison, I would suggest having them read a short poem by Edgar Guest, and then a short poem by Emily Dickinson. And almost all of your students will see the difference immediately. I don't know if name Edgar Guest is probably about as familiar as to them as the name of Ogilvy, but when I was in elementary school, we actually read poems by Edgar Guest. And even as a child, a fairly ignorant child, to boot, I thought they were terrible. I thought they were unbearably corny. And I was cheered, you know, years later when I came across a quote by Dorothy Parker, and she said she'd rather flunk her Wasserman test, which tests for syphilis, than read a poem by Edgar Guest. Okay. The third challenge is to explain the logic of Hume's argument. And that's fun to do. That's really the sweetest part of this. Hume seems to be, in this essay, resolving a paradox. And the paradox is, well, on the one hand, people agree that there is no disputing taste. On the other hand, they often do dispute taste and sometimes even reach consensus that the work of one artist, Emily Dickinson, is much better than the work of another, Edgar Guest. So how can these both things be true? How can taste be indisputable, and yet we do successfully dispute taste at least some of the time? Well, Hume explains this, I think, with great clarity, but you need to sort of walk students through the process of seeing how he develops his argument. And part of it is simply to point out that insofar as a judgment of taste, is merely a report of how we feel, there is no disputing taste. So if a wine tastes bitter to me but sweet to you, there's no room to argue about who's right. We're both right. But judgments of taste become disputable when there are claims about other people, how other people will feel, not just a report about how you feel. Or maybe a claim about how you might come to feel at some future time. So Hume points out, with a nice Aristotelian example, that a man in a fever would not insist on his palate as able to decide concerning flavors, nor would one afflicted with jaundice pretended to give a verdict with regard to colors. Now, this is a basic Humean move. This is just what Hume does over and over again, I think with terrific effect. What he's telling us is that beauty, like other sentiments, including moral sentiments, is in the mind of the beholder. But it is a response to the properties of what is beheld. And some people are better than others at judging whether an object has properties that are likely to elicit an experience of beauty in humans. So what is it that makes one person a better critic than others? And this leads Hume to develop his overview of what constitutes the ideal critic. He summarizes the qualifications of the ideal critic in a single sentence. He says, strong sense united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice. That would be the ideal critic. Now, he admits that critics with all these qualifications may not exist, but even if they don't, simply spelling this out enables us to see that some critics come closer to this than others, and that those that do come closer will be better guides to what we'll find beautiful or admirable, at least over time. He says, if nothing else, the one point I want to make here is that the taste of all individuals is not on an equal footing. So that he thinks he's proved beyond any reasonable doubt. He goes on from there to discuss what we might want to call warranted variations. And he summarizes this quite nicely. He says, age. At 20, Ovid may be the favorite author. Horace at 40. Perhaps Tacitus at 50. Now, these examples are going to be lost on students, I'm afraid. But and for that matter, the experience of aging is going to be lost on my students because they're all pretty much in the 18 to 22 bracket. But they'll get the point. I must say, for me, a kind of vivid example of how one's taste can change over time is the following. I remember when I was, in college and read and saw a performance of Samuel Beckett's Waiting for Godot. I was enormously impressed with it. I mean, I thought it was like, wow, that's the best of the best. And a few years ago, I had the good fortune to see a absolutely first-rate production of this play on Broadway. And I had to say, it didn't move me a bit. I mean, I just thought it was painful to watch, in spite of the excellence of the actors. It doesn't necessarily mean that my judgment now is any better than it was when I was in college. It's just that my taste had really changed, and it was not going to work for me. A second difference in this category for Hume is humor in the Hippocratic sense of the word. And he says, comedy, tragedy, satire, odes, each has its own partisans. Such preferences are innocent and unavoidable and can never reasonably be the object of dispute because there is no standard by which they can be decided. Now, this is an easy point for students to appreciate, and they can come up with examples based upon their own humors. And again, another personal example would be we have friends who seem to like farcical comedies, and we went with them one night to see a performance of The Mystery of Edwin Drood, and they couldn't stop laughing, and my wife and I couldn't start laughing. It was agony for us. A third item in this category is cultural. So it's harder, says Hume, to appreciate the arts of societies whose traditions are different from our own. Here, perhaps, that could be a pretty complicated thing to get into. Some students may have had experiences with this, depending upon their own backgrounds, which would be very useful. And I think that's perhaps the best way to go. One thing you can do if all else fails is to read them a page or maybe less than a page, really, a couple paragraphs of Freud's discussion of jokes. And whatever the merits of Freud's analysis, the jokes that he cites don't even sound like jokes. I don't know where they came from. Maybe they were, current in Austria at the turn of the century. But it's hard to understand that anybody could laugh at them. Anyway, so it's not so hard to come up with appropriate examples. The very end of the essay, Hume talks about moral and religious content. And he says the following, which is he doesn't think that speculative issues, like say whether the context is polytheistic or theistic, should be a problem, but moral issues can be. And I think he's right. And a nice way of illustrating the point that I believe he's trying to make here is to discuss whether we can appreciate, say, the cinematic merit of a film like Birth of a Nation, despite its cruel racism, or Triumph of the Will, despite its glorification of Nazism. So that's it. That's what I have to say about Hume's essay. I hope it's succinct because the essay is succinct.
Thanks, Rick. I love this. And I already asked you if it was okay to ask you a question, so
Sure.
I'm gonna take that as an opening. Thank you for that. I mean, it's so interesting to think about Hume's perspective on this, and obviously, as you said at the beginning, I mean, these questions about what makes a work of art enduring, it's very much like, if not the same as the question of what makes a core text a core text. And I guess that's kind of, perhaps not surprisingly, kind of where my question comes from, my first question, if we have time for more. But it's notoriously difficult to sort of convey the value of a liberal education to someone who hasn't had one.
Sure.
Smart, open-minded, good-natured people who haven't had a liberal education have a hard time seeing why one should. And it seems to me that that's not entirely dissimilar to this question of how one reacts to art, and perhaps how one judges art, especially works of enduring value. So I guess I wonder, and this is a little side question, I guess, but I wonder, where does Hume have any ideas about entry points? I mean, obviously he says Ovid at 20, Horace at 40, so Tacitus at 50, so Ovid would be better entry point. But does he assume, you think, that people will come to this essay having already kind of had an education? I know that he wrote many of his essays for popular audiences, and some of them explicitly for women, and the education of women in his day was different than the education of men. So I don't know if that's relevant, but are these, what do you think about that? Is this sort of standard and developing these kind of capacities over time, taking time, humor, and cultural difference into account, but developing, I'm trying to remember this list because this was such a good list. Developing strong sense, delicate sentiment, something. What do you get with practice? It's refined through practice, perhaps.
Right. I
With,
can reread that if you
yeah,
like.
to reread that because this
Okay,
is the
sure.
good critic,
Um,
right?
The let me see, let me get that lovely quote again here. Oh yeah, here it is. A strong sense united to delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, and cleared of all prejudice.
Yeah, that's so good. I mean, so in so maybe this is another essay, or maybe it's this essay, but does Hume give us a kind of a way in? I mean, we just get to work. Is this kind of like an Aristotelian kind of dialectic where how do you learn to do something? Well, you do it. Is this what Hume's saying? If you want to develop strong sense, delicate sentiment, improved by practice, perfected by comparison, free of prejudice, just get started.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I mean, and Hume's being a little ironic here. He's cleared of all prejudice. He knows
Right.
you can't be cleared of all prejudice. It's just an
Right.
impossible thing. He's making a bit of a joke here, just funnier than Freud's jokes. Yeah, I think he's writing for a general reader, but an educated general reader.
So in a sense, if there's no sort of, so you wouldn't say, do you think Hume would want us to begin with works of imagination? Is that a more apt entry point?
I think what he's talking about here, first of all, on one level, he's talking about beauty, which could be beauty of any kind, and he's talking about artistic merit, which could be artistic merit of any kind. But the class of objects that he addresses in this essay is primarily, we might want to call literary arts, but including oratory, including speeches, which we might not think of as an appropriate subject for an appropriate object, really for artistic judgment. So the orations of Cicero, for example, would be very much the sort of thing that he has in mind here. I think he is thinking of people who have a good, solid general education, and in his day, there was more of a canon than there is now. So the ancients, for example, certainly there was a pretty well fixed canon there, including some people that are not much read anymore, maybe Tacitus and Horace, for example. But he's also talking about modern authors who would be familiar to, I think, many people, and not just philosophers, not just people who were somehow engaged in education, but intelligent, good readers of his time. And remember, his time is right smack in the middle of the Scottish Enlightenment. This is absolutely a golden moment in human history.
One more quick question, if you don't mind. It's related, but I also, it seems to me, maybe this is just, am I getting it right kind of question. It seems to me, back to this great list that I'm apparently enamored of, the sense, sentiment, practice, comparison, prejudice line of the ideal critic. It seems to me that that this standard, even if it's developed, and I'm thinking about the tradition and the cultural difference question here, even though it's developed within a tradition, it develops the capacity to make judgments that go beyond the tradition that you have been immersed in. And so it seems to me that it's an argument that acknowledges that obviously we're not going to read everything there is, and the things that are going to come to us are more likely to come to us because our culture brings them to us in some way. We're going to have to work harder to get to things that our culture doesn't bring to us. But that the sort of all of these qualities that you develop in the process of becoming a good critic will make you able to broaden those boundaries. Does that seem right to you?
Absolutely, 100% right. Yeah. I mean, Hume has a remarkable breadth of vision for a European of his time. And he does talk about the Quran, for example, called the Al-Quran. And so forth, makes frequent references to that, talks a little bit about Asian culture, but the amount of knowledge that was available, the texts that were available, pretty limited. But he is interested in all forms of human culture. And remember that he made his living as a historian. Philosophy was maybe his first love, but he couldn't support himself by writing philosophy. But he did quite well writing works of narrative history.
Great. Thanks. I have a dozen more questions, but I won't ask them now. I'll wait until March 5th, and we hope that you will join us on March 5th for our live Zoom Q&A with Rick. It's at 10 a.m. on March 5th Eastern Standard Time, and the link will be available on the ACTC website where you found this video. Also, I would be remiss if I didn't mention that registration for our spring conference is open. Our conference will be online this year. We're holding it April 12th through 16th. And our conference theme is Crisis and Consolation, Liberal Education in the Time of COVID-19. So if you have thoughts about core texts as giving you perspective or perhaps solace during this pandemic, we hope that you'll submit a proposal and join us for the conference. But before that, we hope that you'll join us March 5th to talk about Hume with Rick Kamber. Thank you so much, Rick. This is great.
Thank you, Charlie. Pleasure.
See you soon.